Over there and over here 녹음 1일차 청크컷 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
A multi-ethnic society makes foreign policy more complicated.
A multi-ethnic society makes foreign policy more complicated.
Here are a few vignettes from Britain over the past week.
Here are a few vignettes from Britain over the past week.
Tens of thousands of protesters marched on the Israeli embassy.
Tens of thousands of
Tens of thousands of protesters marched on the Israeli embassy.
Tens of thousands of protesters marched on the Israeli embassy.
Some shouting Israel is a terror state.
Some shouting Israel is a terror state.
A convoy of vehicles festooned with Palestinian flags.
A convoy of vehicles festooned with Palestinian flags
drove into a heavily Jewish part of North London.
Drove into the heavily Jewish part of North London.
While a thug bellowed, "Fuck the Jews," and raped their daughters.
While a thug bellowed, "F the Jews," and raped their daughters.
Two Leicester City football players celebrated their victory in the FA Cup.
Two Leicester City football players celebrated their victory in the FA Cup
by unveiling a Palestinian flag.
By unveiling a Palestinian flag.
Many of these protesters belong to Britain's large Muslim population.
Many of these protesters belong to Britain's Muslim populations.
The fact that Britain is now a multi-ethnic society means
that
events abroad resonate more loudly than they used to.
That events abroad resonate more loudly as they used to.
The invasion of Iraq under a Labour government.
The invasion of Iraq under the Labour government
infuriated many British Muslims.
The
fate of Kashmir is such a hot issue in Wickham in rural Buckinghamshire.
The fate of Kashmir is such a hot issue in Wickham, rural area of Buckinghamshire,
that the local Tory MP has started the Conservative Friends of Kashmir.
That the local Tory MP has started the
Conservative Friends of Kashmir.
That the local Tory MP has started the Conservative Friends of Kashmir.
Classical statesmen did their best to protect foreign policy from democratic pressures.
Classical statesmen did their best to protect the foreign policy from the
in order to keep their eye, like Plato's guardians, on the state's long-term interests.
From democratic pressures, in order to keep
their eye, like Plato's guardians, on the state's long-term interests.
In order to keep their eye, like Plato's guardians. In order to keep their eye, like Plato's guardians, on the state's long-term interest.
Today, foreign policy is buffeted not just by democratic pressures.
Today, foreign policy is buffeted not only by democratic pressures,
but by ethnic forces. Political parties compete to win the votes of ethnic minorities.
Political parties compete to win the votes of ethnic minorities.
With foreign policy thrown into the bidding wars. The Conservative Party is mounting a challenge. To Labour's traditional hold over
the minorities.
Particularly in non-Muslim populations from the Indian subcontinent.
Particularly in non-Muslim populations.
Particularly in non-Muslim populations from the Indian subcontinent. Indian origin voters favoured Labour over the Conservatives.
Indian origin voters favoured the Labour
by only about 5 to 4 in the 2019 general election.
Favored the Labour over Conservative by only about 5 to 4 in the 2019 general election.
Compared with 3 to 1 among ethnic minorities as a whole.
Compared to 3 to 1 in ethnic minorities as a whole.
The government, therefore, has an interest in forging close relations with India.
The government, therefore, has an interest in forging close relations with India.
Even if that strains relations with Pakistan.
Even if that strains relations with Pakistan.
It also means that party activists have an incentive.
It also means that party activists have incentive
to tell Indian origin voters, sotto voce,
to tell Indian origin voters, sotto voce,
that the Labour Party is a plaything of Muslims in general.
That the Labour Party is a plaything of Muslims in general.
And Pakistan in particular. Ethnic pressure groups are multiplying. There are now 40 to 50 friends groups on the Tory side of the aisle.
There are now 40 to 50 friends of Tory on the aisle.
And about the same number on the Labour side. The Conservative Friends of Israel has helped to turn the Tories.
The Conservative Friends of Israel has helped to turn the Tory
from an instinctively pro-Arab party into a broadly
pro-Israeli one.
Now, a second CFI, the Conservative Friends of India, is on the rise. It points to the growing number of Hindu faces.
In
the upper ranks of the party. Such as the Chancellor Rishi Sunak and the Home Secretary Preeti Patel.
I didn't get that.
It also hinted in 2019 that it could deliver 40 seats for the party. There is much to fear in this. One is the balkanization of foreign policy. Designing policies to suit particular domestic interest groups. Designing policies to suit specific domestic interest groups. Another is raw emotion. The problems of Israel and Kashmir are complicated enough before they become intertwined with the local politics of North London or Bolton. A third is what Samuel Huntington called the clash of civilizations. The more Labour becomes identified with Muslims,
the more Labour is identified with the Muslims,
and the Conservatives with Hindu and Israeli nationalism, identified with Muslims,
the more Labour is
and the Conservatives with Hindu and Israeli nationalism,
the Conservative with Israel and nationalism,
the more wrenching conflicts will be reproduced in Britain's constituencies.
More wrenching conflicts will be
reproduced in Britain's constituencies.
In the Britain's constituency.
How can policymakers avoid such disasters? While acknowledging that Britain has been transformed by mass immigration.
transformed from a mass
It is
immigration.
easy to say that politicians must pursue the national interests rather than the sectional interests of ethnic groups.
It is
Rather than the It is easy to say that politicians must pursue the national interests rather than the sectional interests of ethnic groups.
It is easy to say that politicians must pursue the national interests than sectional interests of minority
But what
groups.
is the national interest?
But what is the national interest?
But the sum of the interests of all the country's citizens.
But the sum of the interests of all of the country's all citizens.
If the composition of those citizens changes,
If the composition of those citizens changes,
then so does that interest.
then so does that interest.
Ethnic groups have a perfect right to organize and agitate.
Ethnic groups have a perfect right to organize and agitate.
And Britain's regional interest in India and Pakistan and Kashmir,
And Britain's regional interest in Pakistan, Kashmir, and Israel
is surely shaped by the fact that millions of British citizens have strong family connections there.
Is surely shaped by the fact that millions of Britain's family have close relations over there.
It is also easy enough to say that policymakers should avoid seeing policy.
It is also easy enough to say that policymakers is seeing policies
through the eyes of particular groups.
Through the eyes of particular groups.
But another danger comes from doing the opposite. Seeing all foreign policy as an extension of domestic struggles.
Seeing all foreign policies
as an extension of domestic struggles. Jeremy Corbyn, Labour's former leader who appeared on the national stage this week.
Jeremy Corbyn, a Labour's leader who appeared on the national stage on this week.
Standing next to an inflatable figure with a hooked nose.
Who is he?
Is a leading offender. He sees groups such as Palestinians and Kashmiris. As the global equivalents of the British working classes.
As the global equivalents of
the British working classes.
Says the global equivalents of Britain's working classes.
A homogeneous mass of the oppressed. Rather than particular peoples operating in particular contexts.
Acting in particular contexts.
Some Brexiteers make the same mistake by positing a global struggle between the forces of rising nationalism on the one hand, and a retreating globalism on the other. Foreign policymakers need to update their skills for a new age. For example, they need to be more sensitive to the importance of cultural ties. And the power of religion. But they also need to make vigorous use of some of the oldest tools in the diplomatic box. Notably, objectivity and skepticism. They should pour cold water on ethnic passions. Even while recognizing the power of those passions. They also need to cut self-proclaimed community leaders and friends organizations.
They also need to cut self-proclaiming leaders
down to size, for neither is truly representative.
Down to size, for neither is truly representative.
Most ethnic communities are divided about foreign policy.
Most ethnic groups are divided by foreign policies.
Many British Jews oppose Israel's policy in the West Bank.
Many Jews oppose to Israeli on the West Bank,
while many young Muslims ignore the elderly imams.
While many young Muslims oppose to old imams
who claim to speak on behalf of their faith. Some Friends organizations are controlled by factions.
Some Friends organization is controlled by factions.
With a very particular take on the domestic policies. Of the countries.
To the very particular take of the domestic countries.
They claim to represent. Others are little more than a handful of lobbyists and a letterhead.
Others are more than a handful of lobbyists and a letterhead.
Others are
a little more than lobbyists and heads. What?
There is also reason for cautious optimism. The country's ethnic minorities ought to be important resources for global Britain. As it turns from Europe to Asia. Who better to forge closer trading ties?
Than
people who can speak the local language. And who have family ties with local trading groups. Norman Tebbit, a Conservative cabinet minister in the 1980s.
Norman what?
Norman Tebbit, a Conservative cabinet minister in the 1980s.
Norman Tebbit, 1980.
Coined his cricket test in the name of division. He wanted to see where people's loyalties lay. But cricket also provides an example of the opposite. A game that was invented by an imperial nation. Is played by Hindus, Muslims, and dozens of other ethnic and religious groups.
These are played by Hindu, Muslims, and dozens of other ethnic and cultural groups.
Put aside their differences. And observe a common set of rules.
끝났습니다.